The early morning sky was still painted with the soft hues of a rising sun as two F-16 fighting Falcons cut through the air, their sleek bodies carving through the thin atmosphere. The pilots, Lieutenant Harris and Captain Mitchell, were used to their routine training flights. But today was different. A minor blip appeared on the radar screen, something that shouldn't have been there, especially at this hour. At first, they shrugged it off, assuming it was just some glitch. "Maybe it's just a bird," Mitchell joked, his voice crackling through the radio. Harris chuckled, but as they focused more on the radar, that slight anomaly grew. It wasn't long before the strange blip began to accelerate. The radar operator's voice came through their headsets, calm but with a slight edge of disbelief. Sir, we've got a civilian aircraft in restricted airspace. Speed indicating Mach 1.1. The words hung in the air like a challenge, absurd yet undeniable. Mach 1. In restricted airspace. Harris echoed, his tone skeptical. Impossible. Must be a radar malfunction. But Mitchell, ever the realist, narrowed his eyes at the radar screen, a frown starting to form. The machine beeped again, the blip expanding across the radar like a ghost. What's going on? That's no civilian craft," Mitchell muttered, more to himself than to his wingman. The pair of pilots exchanged a glance, their amusement fading as the reality of the situation set in. The radar operator's voice was urgent now. "Sir, we're showing sustained speeds past Mach 1. The aircraft's performance doesn't match any civilian model in our data. We need to intercept immediately." Harris's fingers moved quickly to the controls, his mind racing to keep up with the speed of the unfolding situation. "Copy that. Scramble fighters," Harris ordered, his voice steady despite the rush of adrenaline. His hands gripped the controls as he adjusted their flight path toward the unknown aircraft, preparing for the intercept. At first, the pilots thought it might just be a rich civilian flying an experimental jet. They had seen their fair share of high-performance civilian aircraft before, but none of them had ever reached such speeds. "Some billionaire's weekend toy," Mitchell suggested, only half joking. "Wouldn't be the first time a civilian got too bold." Harris replied with a smirk, but the closer they got to the target, the more confusion began to creep into their minds. The aircraft was maintaining that incredible speed with precision, almost as though it was built for it. As they moved closer, the pilots started to notice something else this aircraft didn't look like anything they had seen before. It wasn't a sleek private jet, nor did it resemble the usual military aircraft. It was smaller, older, perhaps a modification of something classic, but the high speed left no doubt it was capable of far more than it should have been. The radio crackled again, this time from the control tower, its tone more official and urgent. "F-16 Squadron, be advised, you are intercepting an aircraft that has exceeded safe flight limits. Maintain caution. Over." Harris flicked a switch, his eyes scanning the skies. "Roger that. We're closing in." They were only moments away from getting a visual on the mysterious aircraft. Mitchell kept his eyes trained on the radar in the skies ahead. He adjusted his throttle, pushing the F-16's engines to the limit, the roar of the jet filling his ears. "We'll catch this guy. No problem," he muttered, as if reassuring himself. But as they crossed the threshold and saw the aircraft coming into view, they realized it wasn't just any ordinary civilian craft. This jet was moving fast, too fast, for anything they had ever encountered before. "That's no amateur at the controls," Harris said, his eyes locked on the target. The sleek, unassuming silhouette of a modified L-39 Albatross came into view. The pilots could hardly believe what they were seeing. This was no high-performance civilian aircraft, and the speed at which it was flying, coupled with its perfect control, made it clear that whoever was in the cockpit wasn't just any pilot. They were about to meet someone who had redefined the very limits of aviation. "Who the hell is flying that thing?" Mitchell asked. As they continued their approach, the question lingered in the air as they closed the gap, the distance between them shrinking with each passing second. But before they could answer, the radar operator's voice came through again, this time in a tone that made both pilots stiffen. "F-16 Squadron, we have the pilot's identification. Stand by for confirmation. Pilot identified as Commander Rachel Monroe. Call sign Viper Ghost. Clearance level unlimited." The words hit like a hammer, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. "Viper Ghost," Harris muttered, his grip tightening on the controls. "The Viper Ghost, the legendary test pilot." Mitchell blinked in disbelief. "No way. That's impossible." The two pilots, once cocky and joking about a rich civilian flying a toy, now found themselves face to face with a legend, A woman who had pushed the boundaries of flight in ways most pilots could only dream of. The reality of the situation set in slowly. They weren't just intercepting any pilot. They were about to fly alongside someone whose name was spoken in reverence in the most secret corners of aviation. Commander Rachel Monroe, or Viper Ghost, was a name that had been etched into the history of flight. And now, the F-16 pilots were about to learn firsthand just how small their world of aviation had been up until now. As the realization sank in, the young pilots' hearts raced not just from the speed and intensity of the mission, but from the awe of knowing they were in the presence of a living legend. The anticipation thickened the air as they prepared to meet the woman who had rewritten the books on speed and precision. The encounter had gone from humorous to serious in a matter of minutes, and the tension now mounted in the cockpit. The unknown aircraft was no longer a mysterious object on a radar screen. It was Rachel Monroe, and the F-16 pilots were about to get a lesson they would never forget. With their target still maintaining an almost absurd speed, the pilots knew they had to act quickly. The mission had just turned into something far more significant than they could have ever anticipated. It was no longer about intercepting an out-of-control civilian aircraft. Now, it was about meeting a living legend, and that realization sent a shiver down their spines. As the two F-16 pilots, Harris and Mitchell, approached the modified L-39 Albatross, the air around them seemed to thicken with anticipation. What had started as a routine intercept mission, something they had both done countless times before, was now turning into something far more significant. The sleek shape of the Albatross cut through the sky at a pace that seemed to defy logic. Its speed was beyond what any civilian aircraft should have been capable of, and its precision was flawless. The control tower had already ordered the pilots to back off slightly, but neither Harris nor Mitchell could help but stare in awe at the jet ahead of them. Despite the intense speed, the aircraft was as stable as a rock, cutting through the air like it had been born for such a task. Rachel Monroe, the pilot at the controls, was a woman who had long been part of aviation lore. She was not just a test pilot, she was an icon, a figure whose name had become synonymous with pushing the limits of what was possible in the sky. As Harris and Mitchell flew alongside her, still trying to process the magnitude of the situation, the radio crackled to life, and a voice from the control tower broke through their haze of confusion. The voice was steady, yet the words it carried were heavy, reverberating through the cockpit with the weight of history. F-16 Squadron, stand by. We have confirmation on the aircraft's identity. The pilot is Commander Rachel Monroe, call sign Viper Ghost, clearance level unlimited. At first, there was silence. The words took a moment to settle into the minds of the young pilots, who had spent their entire careers training to intercept threats. Not legends. Mitchell's mouth went dry. Viper Ghost. His voice was barely above a whisper, the name hanging in the air with the gravity of a bombshell. Harris, ever the professional, still couldn't quite believe it. You've got to be kidding, he said, as though saying the words aloud would make it more real. But it was real. The legendary test pilot, the one who had set speed records that no one had thought could be broken, was sitting just in front of them, flying a modified aircraft at speeds most of the world would never even dream of. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The F-16s, once the stars of the skies, now seemed small and insignificant in comparison to the woman ahead of them. Rachel Monroe wasn't just any pilot. She was a pioneer, a trailblazer who had written the book on supersonic flight and had done it on her own terms. When she flew, the skies became her canvas and the air was her playground. In that moment, the two F-16 pilots were no longer hunters. They were witnesses to something far more rare and far more significant than any training mission or target exercise could ever be. They were flying alongside a living legend. Rachel's modified L-39 Albatross continued to glide through the sky, its engine humming with a controlled power that made it seem effortless. She wasn't showing off. She wasn't even trying to impress anyone. For Rachel, this was just another day in the cockpit, another test flight. But for the two F-16 pilots, this was something entirely different. Their minds raced as they tried to wrap their heads around the reality of the situation. They were being escorted by Viper Ghost, the woman who had rewritten the rules of aviation, the woman who could break speed records without even breaking a sweat. Rachel, of course, didn't show any signs of discomfort. There were no visible signs of stress or strain in her actions. Her hands moved across the controls of the L-39 with the kind of precision that came only from decades of experience. The aircraft, though modified, was still relatively unassuming in appearance. But its performance, its sheer raw power was undeniable. Harris glanced over at Mitchell, the disbelief still visible on his face. We were going to intercept a rogue civilian, And now we're flying with the Viper Ghost, he muttered. Mitchell could only shake his head. Unreal, was all he said, as though words couldn't fully capture what they were experiencing. As they followed Rachel through the air, it became clear that this wasn't just a routine exercise. This was a lesson in flight, a masterclass from someone who had dedicated her life to pushing aviation beyond its limits. The young F-16 pilots had studied flight manuals, had practiced drills, and had been trained to handle just about any situation the skies could throw at them. But they had never faced anything like this before. They were learning firsthand the difference between simply flying and truly mastering the art of flight. Rachel's ability to maneuver her aircraft at such incredible speeds with absolute calmness was a testament to her experience, and the realization was sinking in for Harris and Mitchell that they were in the presence of someone who had set the bar for every other pilot who came after her. The two F-16 pilots maintained their distance, unsure of what to do next. It wasn't every day that you flew next to someone whose very name caused a ripple in the aviation world. I bet we could have hit that speed too, if we had an L-39 and a lifetime of experience, Mitchell said, attempting to break the silence. Harris didn't respond immediately. He was still processing the information. In a way, they had just become part of a story that would be told for years to come. About the time two F-16 pilots escorted Viper Ghost through restricted airspace, completely unaware of who they were dealing with until it was almost too late. Back in the control tower, the reaction was no less subdued. Everyone there knew the name Viper Ghost. It was a name whispered with a mixture of awe and reverence. The air traffic controllers, the sector commander, the officers in the tower, they all recognized the significance of what had just unfolded. This wasn't just any test flight. This was a reminder of what true mastery of the skies looked like. Rachel Monroe wasn't just a part of aviation history. She was still, even in her later years, pushing the boundaries that the next generation of pilots would one day try to surpass. Rachel's L-39 continued its flawless flight path, no different than how it had been when the mission started. The calmness in her movements was the most striking part of it all. She wasn't just operating an aircraft. She was an extension of it, as if she and the plane had become one entity, moving through the skies in perfect harmony. Every slight adjustment, every shift in course, was done with the kind of precision that only comes from years of understanding not just the mechanics of flying, but the very nature of flight itself. And now, as the two young pilots realized, they had just witnessed a lesson in its purest form. Viper Ghost, Mitchell whispered again, his voice full of wonder. Harris didn't need to answer. The name spoke for itself, and the legend was right in front of them. The reality of who they were dealing with had fully sunk in, and all they could do now was ride alongside her, trying to keep up with the speed and skill that seemed to define every aspect of her being. In that moment, they were no longer just two F-16 pilots on a mission. They were part of something far bigger than themselves, a moment in time with a living legend. The F-16s, now fully engaged in their mission, were determined to close the distance between themselves and the modified L-39. Albatross ahead, Harris and Mitchell had their sights set on the target. But the closer they got, the more it became clear that this wouldn't be as easy as any other intercept. The Albatross, still gliding effortlessly through the sky at Mach 1, had already proven itself to be a formidable opponent. The aircraft was small, nimble, and surprisingly quick, handling the high speeds with a level of control that both young pilots had not anticipated. Harris adjusted his course, tightening his formation with Mitchell. The two F-16s were a well-oiled machine, their sleek bodies cutting through the clouds with precision. But as they closed in on the L-39, something unsettling began to happen. No matter how fast they pushed their jets, the gap between them and Rachel's aircraft stayed constant. There was no sudden acceleration, no wild maneuvering, just a calm, steady pace as if the L-39 were moving at its own perfect rhythm, unaffected by the pressure of the jets chasing it. "This is impossible," Harris muttered, his voice tense as he fought the urge to push harder on the throttle. Mitchell glanced over at his wingman, eyes wide with disbelief. The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. They weren't just dealing with a reckless civilian. They were chasing a legend, and the task before them felt more like a test of endurance than an intercept. "We've been flying for years, and we can't even close the gap," Mitchell said, frustration creeping into his voice. It was clear that something was off, and no matter how much they tried to force the issue, they were falling short. The sheer control that Rachel demonstrated was beyond what they had ever been trained to handle. As they continued their pursuit, Rachel's L-39 remained steady in the sky, never wavering. Harris and Mitchell were relentless, their focus unwavering. But their respect for the pilot ahead of them was growing with each passing. Second, the name Viper Ghost wasn't just a title, it was a legacy. The woman they were chasing wasn't just flying an aircraft, she was teaching them a lesson about the limits of speed and control, lessons they hadn't even known they needed. In the cockpit of the L-39, Rachel remained unruffled, her gaze fixed on the horizon as if nothing were amiss. She had flown thousands of hours, testing aircraft at limits that made most pilots tremble. The F-16s were no threat to her. They were just another challenge, another test. Rachel had learned long ago that controlling an aircraft at supersonic speeds wasn't about brute force or the fastest engines, it was about finesse, about understanding the aircraft and the air around you, and most importantly, about knowing when to push and when to hold back. The tension in the air grew thick, as if the skies themselves were holding their breath. Harris and Mitchell, determined as ever, began to maneuver their F-16s more aggressively, trying to close the distance with greater speed. But each time they edged closer, Rachel seemed to glide just out of reach, maintaining that same pace, never increasing her speed, never breaking a sweat. It was almost as if she were showing them how little it took to maintain control at Mach 1.1, something they hadn't yet mastered. They had been trained for speed, but not for the delicate balance that Rachel had perfected. "I don't get it," Mitchell said, voice tight with the strain of trying to keep up. We're pushing everything we've got, and she's just flying like it's nothing." Harris didn't respond immediately. He was too focused, too immersed in the chase to say anything. But inside, he was beginning to question everything he had thought he knew about flying. They had been taught that speed was the ultimate measure of a pilot's skill. Yet here was a woman, flying a less powerful aircraft, outpacing them with what seemed like no effort at all. As the chase continued, the realization began to dawn on them. This wasn't just a game of speed. This was a lesson, one that was being taught in real time. And they were the students. The F-16s had superior firepower, faster engines, and superior technology. Yet, Rachel, in her modest L-39, was schooling them in the art of flight. She wasn't just outpacing them. She was showing them how to control the skies, without relying on brute force. Her calm, measured control over the L-39 was something they couldn't replicate, no matter how hard they tried. The radio crackled again, breaking through the quiet determination in Harris and Mitchell's minds. The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "F-16s. This is control. Proceed with caution. Maintain safe separation from the civilian aircraft." The message was clear. The chase was no longer about proving who was faster. It was about understanding that there was more to flying than just pushing the limits of speed. Rachel, once again, had shown them that sometimes true skill wasn't about speed, it was about control. Despite their frustration, Harris and Mitchell pushed on. They were pilots, trained to handle any situation, and they weren't about to back down. They had one job: intercept and identify the target. But as the minutes ticked by, their confidence began to falter. They had learned this lesson before. In simulators and training exercises, no mission was ever as easy as it seemed. At first, the real test came when you were forced to face the unexpected, when you were forced to challenge your own limits. And so, as the F-16 pilots continued to chase the L-39, something began to change within them. It wasn't just about the mission anymore. It was about respect. Respect for the skill, the precision, and the experience of the woman ahead of them. It was about realizing that the greatest challenge they would ever face wasn't a target in the sky, it was understanding the limits of their own capabilities and learning how to surpass them. As they maneuvered in tight formation, struggling to close the distance, the once lighthearted banter between them had stopped. The jokes had faded into silence. There was only the hum of the engines, the flickering radar screen, and the realization that they were being tested in ways they hadn't expected. They were being asked to keep up with a living legend, someone who had pushed the boundaries of flight beyond what they had ever imagined. The challenge had shifted. It was no longer about completing the mission. It was about understanding the lesson that was unfolding before them. The tension in the air grew thicker as the two F-16s continued to push the limits of their capabilities. Despite their best efforts, they couldn't seem to match Rachel's calm, steady pace. Every maneuver they made, every acceleration, was met with the same calm resistance from the L-39. The lesson was clear: speed alone wasn't enough. In order to truly master flight, they would have to learn how to fly with the same grace and precision that Rachel did, and that, for Harris and Mitchell, was the real challenge. They had thought they were chasing an out-of-control civilian, but they were chasing something far greater, a pilot who had rewritten the very rules of aviation. And as the sky stretched out before them, they realized they weren't just learning to intercept an aircraft. They were learning what it truly meant to be a master of the skies. The air was thick with tension as the two F-16s continued to trail Rachel. Monroe's modified L-39 Albatross. Harris and Mitchell, their focus unbroken, pushed their jets even harder, desperately trying to close the gap. But as they neared her aircraft, the steady beat of her flight became even more mesmerizing. Rachel seemed unfazed by the two fighters tailing her, continuing her controlled flight at Mach 1, one with a grace that could only be described as effortless. Every maneuver she made was as if she was in complete harmony with the sky, pushing the limits with subtle precision. The pilots of the F-16s, still struggling to match her pace, had begun to realize the futility of their efforts. The radio crackled, cutting through the quiet determination of the moment. It was a voice they had heard before, but now the tone was different, serious and weighted. F-16 Squadron, be advised, this is command. We have full confirmation on the aircraft's identity. Harris's grip tightened on the controls, his breath steady but slow as he waited for what was coming next. The pilot is Commander Rachel Monroe. Call sign Viper Ghost. Clearance level unlimited. Do not attempt further interception. Escort only. The words hung in the air like a weight, each syllable shifting the entire dynamic of the situation. The realization hit them both at once, and for a moment, neither of them knew what to say. They had been chasing a living legend, not an ordinary civilian or a rogue aircraft. Viper Ghost, the woman whose name had become synonymous with breaking every speed record imaginable, was the very person they had been hunting. They weren't intercepting a random aircraft anymore. They were escorting someone who had redefined what was possible in aviation. Mitchell's voice finally broke the silence. Viper Ghost. The words were barely a question, more of an incredulous whisper. Harris, his mind racing to process the information, nodded slowly, a mix of disbelief and awe flooding his chest. We've been chasing a goddamn legend. His voice had changed, no longer carrying the usual cocky confidence but a deep respect that was quickly growing. As the magnitude of the situation began to sink in, the F-16 pilots found themselves facing an uncomfortable truth. They had been so confident, so certain of their ability to perform, but now they were up against something far greater than any of them had anticipated. They were flying alongside Viper Ghost, a woman who had pioneered the very skills they were still perfecting. She was no longer just a name from a training manual or a page in the history books. She was right there, in front of them, showing them just how much they still had to learn. Control, Harris finally responded, his voice steady but with a new sense of reverence. What's the plan? The response came back quickly. Escort the aircraft to the designated flight path. Maintain distance and ensure safe passage. Do not engage unless directed otherwise. It was clear now this was no longer about proving their superiority. It wasn't about speed or intercepting a target. They were here to learn, to bear witness to something far beyond their training and their skills. The two F-16 pilots fell into a quiet formation behind Rachel's L-39, the once playful chase now transforming into a silent escort. Mitchell's earlier frustration had shifted into awe. He couldn't take his eyes off the L-39 as it continued to cut through the air, with flawless precision. Every slight adjustment she made was a testament to years of experience, years spent pushing boundaries that most pilots would never dare to approach. In that moment, Mitchell realized that what they had been trying to catch was not just an aircraft, it was a piece of aviation history. Harris glanced at Mitchell, a small, almost imperceptible smile forming on his face. She's not just a pilot, she's an artist. Mitchell nodded, his expression serious, his earlier skepticism replaced with full respect. Yeah, she's rewriting the book right in front of us. The young pilots had learned more in the past few minutes than they had in years of training. They had come here to catch an out-of-control civilian aircraft, but instead, they had been handed a front-row seat to a masterclass in aviation. As the F-16s kept their formation, the radio crackled once again. This time, it was from one of the younger pilots in the command tower. His voice, though respectful, carried a mixture of shock and excitement. "Command, this is Raptor Lead. We've got eyes on Viper Ghost. We're flying with her." His voice trailed off, as though he still couldn't fully process the gravity of the situation. Harris let out a low laugh, the first sign of ease since the whole encounter had begun. "Yeah, kid, you are..." The L-39 continued to soar, its flight path smooth and unbroken, as if it were floating effortlessly through the sky. Rachel's calm voice finally came over the radio, breaking the silence. "F-16s, this is Monroe. Appreciate the escort. Keep your distance and don't worry. I'm not going anywhere. Just enjoy the ride." The words were simple, but they held a level of confidence that could only come from someone who had pushed beyond every boundary imaginable. The two F-16 pilots, once filled with youthful bravado, now sat quietly, humbled by the experience. As they continued to fly in formation with Rachel, the respect they had for her grew with each passing minute. Harris looked out across the horizon, his mind trying to grasp the magnitude of what was happening. Here he was, flying alongside someone who had set records that no one else had come close to breaking. This wasn't just a routine mission. This was a chance to witness greatness in action. "Do you think we'll ever be as good as her?" Mitchell asked, the question hanging in the air, unanswered. Harris paused, the weight of the question heavy on his mind. "Maybe, but I don't think anyone will ever break the limits she's broken." The two young pilots continued to follow Rachel through the skies, no longer trying to keep up or challenge her, but simply to learn from her. The air felt different now, filled with a new sense of understanding. They had come here with one mission to intercept a rogue aircraft, but what they had found instead was a lesson in mastery, in precision, and in the very essence of what it meant to be a pilot. By the time they reached their designated flight path, Rachel had already completed a flawless maneuver, making it look effortless. She had not only shown them her skill, she had shown them the kind of humility and confidence that came from being at the top of her field for so long. And as they turned back toward base, Harris and Mitchell knew one thing for certain: they would never forget this day. They hadn't just escorted a civilian pilot. They had flown with a legend. In the quiet of their cockpits, with the hum of the engines in the background, the two young pilots silently processed what had just occurred. They had been given a rare gift, a chance to learn from the best, to witness firsthand what it meant to break boundaries in the sky. The respect they had once taken for granted had transformed into awe, and they knew, deep down, that the flight they had just experienced would shape the rest of their careers. They had truly flown alongside greatness. The radio crackled again, and for a moment, it felt as though the sky itself was holding its breath. Rachel's voice, calm and steady, came through clearly. "F-16s, this is Monroe. I appreciate the escort, but let's talk about something more useful now. Shall we?" There was no hint of arrogance in her voice, just an understated confidence that commanded attention. "You're both good pilots, but it seems you've been focused on the wrong thing. You've been chasing speed, thinking that would make you great pilots. Let me tell you, it's not speed that makes a true aviator." Harris and Mitchell exchanged a glance, both of them absorbing her words. They had been trained to push their jets to the edge, to be faster than anyone else. Speed was the measure of a pilot's skill. At least, that's what they had always believed. But now, hearing Rachel's calm, almost detached voice, they were starting to wonder if they had missed something important. Their pursuit of the L-39 had been all about pushing their jets to the limit. But Rachel had shown them that perhaps there was more to flying than simply being the fastest. Mitchell adjusted his flight path, listening closely as Rachel continued. "Speed, while impressive, is a crutch. The true challenge is control. It's about how you handle the aircraft at high speeds, how you make it do exactly what you want without forcing it, without fighting against the forces in the sky." Rachel's words were a slow, deliberate cadence, designed to make them think, to really digest the weight of what she was saying. "You both have been trained to fly fast, to beat records, but the real lesson is knowing how to make that speed work for you, not the other way around." The young pilots were silent for a moment, taking in the magnitude of Rachel's message. They had spent years in training, clocking hours in simulators, learning how to squeeze every bit of performance out of their F-16s. But here they were, flying alongside a woman who had mastered what they thought they knew, a woman who could make the impossible seem routine. Harris finally broke the silence, his voice quieter now. "So, it's not about being the fastest?" It was a question, but it didn't sound like one. It sounded more like a realization. Rachel's voice came through, full of understanding. "It's about being precise. It's about knowing the limits of your aircraft and knowing when to push those limits and when to hold back. Speed can get you into trouble if you don't know how to control it. And the difference between a great pilot and a legend is how well you manage that." The two F-16 pilots listened, captivated by her words. For the first time, they truly understood what Rachel was talking about. They weren't just intercepting an aircraft anymore. They were learning the core principles of mastery. They had been so fixated on chasing speed, on trying to match Rachel's incredible pace, that they hadn't stopped to think about what made her capable of it in the first place. It wasn't just speed. It was her unparalleled control over the aircraft, the way she could push it to the limits while still maintaining perfect stability and precision. You've got to learn the rhythm of your aircraft, Rachel continued, her voice remaining steady and calm. Every plane has its own personality, its own quirks. You've got to become one with it. Feel it in your hands, in your movements, and when you reach that point, when you and the aircraft are perfectly in sync, that's when you can truly start to break boundaries. But you've got to do it with respect. Mitchell, his hands gripping the controls a little tighter now, glanced over at Harris. Respect, he asked, his voice filled with curiosity. Rachel's voice came back, almost as if she had anticipated the question. Yes, respect. Respect for the aircraft, for the forces acting upon it, and for your own limits. Speed doesn't mean anything if you can't control it. And control is built on experience, patience, and a deep understanding of how your aircraft behaves in every situation. There was a pause as the F-16 pilots processed her words. It was one thing to hear these lessons in a classroom or a debriefing room. It was another to hear them from a legend who had lived them, who had tested the limits in ways they could only dream of. Rachel's teaching was subtle, but it was deeply transformative. She wasn't just telling them to fly slower or faster. She was teaching them to be better, to be smarter. She was teaching them that being the fastest wasn't the goal. Being the best was. The two young pilots adjusted their flight, following Rachel as she continued to maneuver the L-39 with the precision of a maestro conducting a symphony. Harris was the first to speak after a long silence. I thought I understood flying, he said, his voice a little quieter than before. But you're right. I've been chasing speed, and that's not enough. Mitchell nodded in agreement. Yeah, it's not just about hitting Mach 1.1 and beyond. It's about control. Like she said, about knowing when to push, when to pull back. Rachel, hearing their reflections, responded, her tone still calm but tinged with approval. Exactly. You're starting to get it. Remember, it's not the fastest aircraft that wins the race. It's the one that's in the lead at the right moment. That's what you'll learn as you keep flying. You won't always be the fastest, but you'll be the most prepared when it counts. For a while, there was nothing but the hum of the engines and the sound of the wind rushing, past as the F-16s and the L-39 maintained their steady formation. The lesson was sinking in, and both Harris and Mitchell felt a shift in their understanding of aviation. What had once seemed like an impossible mission, a high-speed chase to catch a rogue pilot, had turned into something far more valuable. They weren't just flying next to Viper Ghost. They were learning from her. The rest of the flight was spent in relative silence, broken only by occasional radio calls from the control tower. Rachel's words echoed in the minds of the young pilots as they followed her, with newfound respect. They were no longer just chasing her for the sake of a mission. They were flying with her to understand the true meaning of mastery. By the time they approached their destination, Harris and Mitchell were different pilots. They had learned more in those few minutes than in years of training. They had learned that speed, while impressive, was only one part of being a great pilot. Precision, control, and respect were what truly separated the best from the rest. As they began their descent, Rachel's voice came over the radio one last time. You've done well, both of you. You've learned more in the past hour than most pilots learn in a lifetime. Just remember, the sky belongs to those who understand it. The rest are just along for the ride. Harris and Mitchell, now humbled by the experience, nodded to themselves, silently agreeing with every word. They had learned that lesson well. It wasn't about being the fastest. It was about knowing when to fly fast, when to hold back, and most importantly, when to truly respect the sky and the aircraft that carried them. They had seen what true mastery looked like, and they knew they had a long way to go before they could even hope to approach it. But for the first time, they understood what they were striving for. As the L-39 Albatross continued its steady course through the skies, the F-16 pilots, Harris and Mitchell, began to realize just how much more was at stake than simply completing a routine intercept. The mission they had originally thought of as a simple exercise was rapidly evolving into something far more significant. Rachel's flight, and by extension, her role, was not just a test of aviation limits. It was part of a much larger, far-reaching mission. A mission that would help shape the future of America's defense capabilities in a world where new, unseen threats could emerge at any moment. Flying alongside Rachel, the young pilots started to grasp the depth of the exercise they were part of. The Pentagon had long recognized the value of these high-speed tests, understanding that they were more than just about setting records. They were about testing the capabilities of the nation's military, testing its readiness to face challenges that had not yet materialized but could one day come to pass. Each flight Rachel conducted was more than a routine evaluation. It was a precursor to the next phase of military defense, an assessment that would expose weaknesses and reveal the limits of current capabilities. It was a way to ensure that America could always stay one step ahead, prepared for whatever the future might hold. The importance of Rachel's work was now clear to Harris and Mitchell. They had started their day thinking they were chasing a rogue civilian aircraft, but now they understood that what they were witnessing was part of a carefully orchestrated effort to push the boundaries of aviation and defense systems. Rachel Monroe was not just a test pilot, she was a guardian of America's future security. Her flights were testing more than aircraft performance. They were testing the very limits of what was possible to ensure the country's readiness for potential future threats. This wasn't about showing off or setting records. It was about making sure that when the day came that new threats appeared on the horizon, the United States would be ready to face them. As they escorted Rachel's L-39, the realization sunk in deeper for both F-16 pilots. The aircraft they were flying in fast, powerful, and capable was being tested by one of the best pilots in history. And their job was no longer just to keep up. They were part of something greater, something that would shape the course of America's defense strategy for years to come. The L-39, a modest training aircraft, had been outfitted to test the limits of military readiness. It wasn't a glamorous piece of equipment, but it was doing something critical, simulating the kind of fast, unpredictable threats that the military had to be prepared to handle. Rachel's test flights weren't just about her skill or the performance of the aircraft she piloted. They were about the next generation of pilots and defense systems. It was about ensuring that every pilot, every aircraft, every piece of technology that made up America's military machine was capable of handling what might come in the future. As Harris and Mitchell followed Rachel, they saw the significance of the mission in a way they never had before. They weren't just witnessing a demonstration of skill, they were witnessing the future of military readiness. A readiness that would keep America safe in an increasingly unpredictable world. For the first time, they realized just how crucial Rachel's work was. The country's defense didn't rely on just one person, just one plane, or just one strategy. It was a constant process of testing and reevaluating, of pushing the limits to make sure that America's military could meet any challenge. The young pilots had thought they were simply along for the ride, but now they understood that they were part of the test. They were witnessing firsthand how the next generation of pilots and military personnel would be prepared. It wasn't just about flying fast. It was about being able to handle what came next, no matter what form it took. As they continued their flight, Harris couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride and respect. He had always been proud to be a pilot in the United States Air Force, but now, flying alongside Rachel, he felt the weight of his responsibility in a new way. The job of a pilot wasn't just to fly fast and break records. It was to be ready to be prepared for the unknown, to make sure that the nation's defense was strong enough to withstand any threat, no matter where it came from. And Rachel was the embodiment of that preparation. She wasn't just showing them how to fly, she was showing them how to be ready for whatever was next. Mitchell, too, began to reflect on the broader mission at hand. In the heat of the chase, he had been focused on trying to catch up to Rachel, trying to match her speed. But now, as they flew in formation, he understood that the true measure of a pilot wasn't in speed. It was in understanding the bigger picture, in realizing that each test, each flight, was part of a larger strategy to ensure national security. What they were witnessing was more than a test of aviation. It was a test of America's ability to remain at the forefront of defense, technology, a test of the military's readiness to adapt to the future. Rachel's role was, in many ways, a thankless one. She wasn't performing stunts for a crowd or making headlines for breaking speed records, but her work was crucial to the very foundation of America's defense. And now, as Harris and Mitchell flew beside her, they understood how much her work impacted the future of the country. They were not just flying next to a legendary pilot. They were flying alongside someone who was testing the very systems that would protect America for generations to come. As the flight continued, the two young pilots couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. They had been part of something far greater than themselves. The mission had begun as a simple escort, but now it had become a powerful lesson about duty, readiness, and the unyielding responsibility of the nation's defense. The legacy of Rachel Monroe's flights wasn't just about her records or her skill. It was about ensuring that the nation would always be ready, no matter what the future might bring. And as they turned their aircraft toward base, the full significance of their role in this mission became clear. They were the ones who would carry forward the lessons learned today. They were the ones who would pass on the lessons of precision, of readiness, and of respect for the legacy of those who came before them. The torch was now in their hands, and they understood that it was their duty to carry it forward. At the Pentagon, the briefing on Rachel's flight was already being reviewed. Her test had shown the current defense strategies worked, but there was still work to be done. There would be more tests, more flights, more assessments. The future threats were unknown. But with pilots like Rachel pushing the limits, the country would always be ready. As Harris and Mitchell touched down, they had a new understanding of their role in America's defense. It was no longer just about their individual skills. It was about the larger mission. A mission to ensure that the United States was prepared for whatever challenges the future held. And they knew that, as part of that mission, they were following in the footsteps of a legend, ensuring that her legacy would continue long after they had left the skies. The officers' club was quieter than usual as Rachel walked in, her boots tapping lightly against the wooden floor. Harris and Mitchell had already arrived, still in their flight suits, and they stood as she entered. There was a new reverence in their posture, a quiet respect that hadn't been there before. The usual banter between the young pilots was absent, replaced by an almost palpable sense of admiration. They had just witnessed something extraordinary in the skies, and now they were about to sit across from the woman who had defined what it meant to be a master of flight. Rachel smiled as she slid into a seat, the weight of the day's lessons still settling in. She wasn't one for fanfare or attention. It had never been about that for her. It was always about pushing boundaries, testing limits, and preparing for the unknown. "What's the verdict, boys?" she asked with a light-hearted grin, her voice breaking the stillness in the room. Her casual tone made it clear that she wasn't here to lecture but to share, to pass on the lessons she had learned throughout her long and storied career. Harris, still a bit in awe, was the first to speak. "I don't think I've ever really understood what it means to be a pilot until today," he said, his voice thoughtful. "You weren't just flying. You were living in the sky. It was like you and the plane were one." Mitchell nodded in agreement, his usual bravado replaced by humility. "Yeah, we've been taught to break records, to fly fast. But it's not about that, is it? It's about control, precision." Rachel leaned back in her chair, her eyes reflecting the years of experience and knowledge that came with being at the top of her field. "It's not just about going fast, gentlemen. Anyone can push an aircraft to its limits. But mastering it, that takes time, patience, and respect. When you understand your aircraft, when you know its limits better than anyone else, that's when you can truly start to fly. Speed is just a number. The real challenge is how you control that speed." The young pilots listened intently, hanging on to every word Rachel said. For the first time, they began to see flying not as a competition but as a lifelong pursuit. Rachel continued, her voice calm and measured as she shared her experiences. "When I started, I was just like you, eager, hungry to prove myself. But over the years, I learned that the best pilots aren't the ones who are first to the finish line. They're the ones who know when to slow down, when to speed up, and when to just let the plane do its thing." Mitchell leaned forward, the curiosity in his eyes reflecting a desire for understanding. "How do you know when to push and when to hold back?" he asked. The question was simple, but the answer was something Rachel had spent years figuring out. She smiled softly, her eyes distant for a moment as if reflecting on the many years of flying. "It's not always obvious. Sometimes you're in a situation where you have to push past your comfort zone, and that's when you need to trust your instincts. But more often than not, it's about feeling the aircraft, understanding it like a partner. You can't force it to do something it's not ready for, and if you do, that's when mistakes happen." Harris nodded, his expression now one of deep reflection. "I guess we've always been taught to push harder, to be the fastest. But what you're saying is, it's not about being the fastest. It's about knowing the limits." "Exactly," Rachel replied. "It's about understanding what the aircraft is telling you. Every plane is different. You can have the most advanced technology in the world, but without the right pilot, it's just a machine. The true mastery comes when you learn to work with that machine, to use it in ways that others wouldn't think possible." Mitchell, who had always prided himself on his speed, now looked at Rachel with newfound respect. "You make it sound so easy," he said. But there was no trace of sarcasm in his voice, just genuine admiration. "How do you stay so calm, even when you're flying at speeds that seem impossible?" Rachel's smile was small but knowing. "It's not about staying calm, Mitchell. It's about staying focused. When you're flying at those speeds, everything happens so fast. Your mind has to be clear, your hands steady. It's a mental game as much as it is a physical one. And the more you fly, the more you learn how to anticipate what's coming before it even happens. It's like reading the sky, reading the aircraft. You have to trust yourself. Harris chuckled softly, a hint of admiration in his voice. I don't think we've even scratched the surface of that kind of flying. He looked at Mitchell, then back at Rachel. You make it sound like an art form, not just a job. Rachel shrugged slightly, her gaze thoughtful. For me, it is an art. The sky is my canvas, and every flight is a chance to create something new. It's about breaking boundaries, yes, but it's also about knowing that the journey is just as important as the destination. There's always something to learn, something new to try, and that's what keeps me coming back. The conversation continued for hours, with the pilots asking questions and Rachel answering with the wisdom that only someone who had lived through decades of experience could provide. They spoke of her time as a test pilot, of the missions she had flown that tested the very limits of aviation. They spoke of the mistakes she had made and the lessons she had learned from them, the ones that had shaped her into the pilot she was today. Through each story, through each lesson, Rachel imparted more than just technical knowledge. She taught the young pilots about humility, about the importance of patience, and about the value of understanding the bigger picture. As the evening wore on, Harris and Mitchell realized how much they still had to learn. They had flown with one of the best pilots in history, and they had witnessed firsthand the true meaning of mastery. They had spent their careers chasing speed, chasing records, but now they understood that it wasn't speed that made a pilot great. It was understanding control and the humility to know that even the best pilots had more to learn. As they left the officers' club that night, the young pilots felt a deep sense of gratitude. They had been given a rare opportunity to learn from a legend, to hear the wisdom of someone who had not only broken records, but had paved the way for future generations of aviators. And they knew that the lessons they had learned that night would stay with them for the rest of their careers. Rachel, too, felt a sense of satisfaction. She had done what she had set out to do, not just to show the young pilots how to fly, but to pass on the lessons that had shaped her own journey. She knew that the next generation of pilots, those who would one day fly higher, faster, and further than she ever could, would carry those lessons with them into the future. And that, to her, was the true legacy of aviation. The sky had always been a place of endless possibility, a vast expanse where limits were meant to be tested and broken. Rachel Monroe, known in aviation circles as Viper Ghost, had spent her career doing just that, pushing the boundaries of flight, shattering records, and, most importantly, ensuring that America's military was always prepared for the challenges of the future. But as she looked back on her long career, she realized that her true legacy wasn't just about the records she had set or the speed she had achieved. It was about the lessons she had imparted to the next generation of pilots and the future of American defense. Flying alongside her, young pilots like Harris and Mitchell had witnessed firsthand what it meant to truly master an aircraft, to understand not just its capabilities but its limits. They had come into the mission with the goal of intercepting a rogue civilian aircraft, but they had left with something far more valuable, a deeper understanding of what it meant to be a pilot and how to approach aviation with respect and precision. They had seen, through Rachel's example, that true mastery wasn't about raw speed, it was about control, focus, and the willingness to challenge not only the aircraft, but the very limits of what was possible. For the young pilots, this experience had been nothing short of transformative. They had entered the skies thinking they were on a routine mission, but they had encountered something much more profound. The reality of what they had witnessed was sinking in, and they began to understand the true value of Rachel's work. Her missions weren't just about flying fast or setting records. They were about preparing America's defense for the future, testing systems, and ensuring that the country was ready to face the unknown challenges that awaited it. As they debriefed in the officers' club, Rachel's words echoed in their minds. She had taught them that the key to being a great pilot wasn't about being the fastest or the strongest. It was about understanding your aircraft, reading the sky, and knowing when to push and when to hold back. But her lessons extended beyond the cockpit. They were about duty, responsibility, and the importance of being prepared for whatever threats might arise in the future. Rachel's legacy was a legacy of preparation, of readiness, and of ensuring that America's military would always be a step ahead. As the pilots sat in the club, reflecting on their experience, they realized that the true value of their work was not in what they achieved today, but in what they were preparing for tomorrow. The lessons they had learned from Rachel would stay with them, shaping the way they approached their own careers and preparing them for the challenges that lay ahead. The next generation of aviators, those who followed in their footsteps, would be tasked with keeping America safe in a world that was always evolving. The skies were changing, and the threats that could one day emerge were unlike anything they had ever seen before. But with pilots like Rachel, and the lessons she had passed down, they would be ready. They would be prepared to fly beyond the limits, to test the boundaries, and to protect the nation against whatever came next. As Harris and Mitchell took off for their next mission, they looked at the sky with a new sense of purpose. They were no longer just pilots in training. They were part of something far larger, a movement that would define the future of American defense. They knew they had a responsibility to carry forward the lessons they had learned from Rachel. It was no longer just about speed. It was about being ready, about ensuring that the next generation of pilots would be equipped to handle the unknown, to break the rules, and to do what others thought impossible. Rachel Monroe was more than just a legend. She was the embodiment of the spirit of aviation, the unyielding drive to push beyond the sky's limits. Her legacy would live on, not just in the records she had set, but in the pilots she had inspired and the future she had helped shape. As she disappeared into the horizon, her presence lingered in the hearts and minds of those who had flown beside her. They would never forget the lessons she had imparted, lessons about control, about precision, and about the importance of always being ready to fly beyond the limits. The sky belongs to those who break its rules, to those who dare to push the boundaries and redefine what is possible. It belongs to the ghosts who test the limits, who fly faster than sound, and who keep America's defense strong. And as long as there are pilots like Rachel Monroe, the sky will always be in good hands. She had shown them what true mastery looked like. And now, it was their turn to carry the torch and ensure that the legacy of those who fly beyond would never fade. The challenge was theirs, and they were ready to embrace it. The future of aviation, of defense, and of freedom rested in their hands. The ghosts of the sky had paved the way, and it was up to them to keep flying beyond